Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo podcast. After the Battle of the Alamo, just a few survivors remained to share the story. Their first-hand accounts quickly spread, but in this pre-digital era, the stories evolved to include some of the myths and the legends we still hear today. Today, we reveal some of the biggest tall tales, from Travis's line in the sand to Sam Houston's order to blow up the Alamo, as our experts separate fact from fiction and place these myths and legends in their proper place and how people across generations remember the Alamo. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. We're joined by Ernesto Rodriguez, the Alamo Senior Curator, Historian, and Lecturer, as well as Tom Castanos, the Alamo's Director of Interpretation. Thank you both for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to break down some myths and legends in a moment, but first, let's talk about how these stories get circulated. After the Battle of the Alamo, the first-hand accounts from survivors quickly spread. How did they evolve over time?
You know, like any kind of story, myth, and I'm going to use terms like urban legend and things like that. I want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting that's what these things are, but these stories often spread the same way. So, they begin with a kernel or maybe a significant amount of truth. And then from there, they're embellished every time they're passed on. If you remember the old telephone game as children where you whisper something in one person's ear, and by the time it gets all the way around the room, it's an entirely different story. Now take that, but don't whisper anything in anybody's ear, right? If there's a vacuum, a lack of information, then all that's left is for people to make their own.
How do people today hear these stories and believe them to be true?
One of the things that happens is that a lot of times the story, because it's passed down for generation to generation, it becomes true. But when you go back and you dig through sources, you learn that a lot of it is not true. Now, when we think about the stories that are coming up, how many people were literate in the 1830s? And so when you think about who's writing the stories down, it's newspapermen for the most part. This is the age of yellow journalism where you want to sensationalize stories. And so that's what happens. But at the same time, you have the birth of a republic. And so when you have the birth of a new nation, along with it comes the mythology behind that birth. And the Alamo story fits perfectly into that mythology.
And what's the difference between a myth and a legend?
So I think right off the bat, a myth, as the name implies, is not true. It is something that is made up. A legend, it typically is based in truth, much the same way once again, we talk about an urban legend. They say that's something that is told one person removed. You didn't experience, the person you're talking to didn't experience it, but they said, oh, no, my uncle once saw. A legend in many ways is the same thing. They'll take an event and then they'll embellish it to make it a more complete story. As human beings, we love stories. And we typically like stories with beginnings, middles, and ends with a big crescendo in the middle. If that original nugget of truth doesn't have all those elements, well, people are more than willing to fill in the blanks.
Okay, let's do some myth busting. For each one, let's talk about where the myth or legend came from and then break down whether we know if any of it is true. We'll start with perhaps the biggest one. Did Travis really draw that line in the sand?
We will never know.
So more of a legend.
It's a legend. It's based on a story that is passed down by William Physick Zuber. He's the one that tells the story about almost 40 years after the Battle of the Alamo. And when he tells the story, people ask him, where did you get it? And he says, my mom told me that, that she was told by Moses Rose about it. When people question him early on, he basically, one of the defenses is, are you calling my mom a liar? People back off. You fast forward, and many years later, he says, I embellished the story, but he never told us how. And so that adds more mystery to this, because did he embellish the line part? Did he embellish the speech? Did he embellish it all? We will never know. But is it possible for Travis to have done this? Yes. He was an avid reader. And there was a book that was published on Pizarro and the conquest of the Incas. And Pizarro drew a line in the sand. We know in 1835, Benjamin Rush Milam drew a line in the sand. So is it possible? Yes. Will we ever truly know? No.
And if I'm not mistaken, that goes all the way back to Spartan mythology as well. There's a line in the sand story. But I'm going to add a 20 and 21st century twist to that. Now you take a legend and you immortalize it in cinema or in popular television shows, which sadly or happily, I mean, you and I both have spent some time working in the television business. We're happy that we did it, but it reaches so many more people than a scholarly document does. And it becomes a truth unto itself if that particular image or film or whatever is very popular, much like the John Wayne movie.
It just really resonates with people.
Absolutely. That means it was a good script writing, right? It was successful in what they attempted to do as a movie. And I don't think if you went back and asked John Wayne if we could, are you telling a historical? No, I'm making a movie. That would have been the answer most likely. But sadly, we sometimes take those kinds of things for facts.
You alluded to this earlier. Let's go back to Moses Rhodes. Legend has it he was the only one not to cross that line. Where did that come from? And is there evidence he was even at the battle?
So that comes from, once again, William Physics Zuber, and where he got the line in the sand story. And you think about it. Now, Moses Rhodes was an individual. He passed away in about 1850, buried somewhere in Louisiana. Way it goes is that he had been with Napoleon. He had fought with Napoleon, the Frenchman. And the story goes that he really saw the odds against him and said, see you later. And he's allowed to leave.
So we're going to put this in the legend category.
It's in the legend. So it's a real individual telling a story to a family, and the family is predominantly German, I believe, and hard of hearing. He is French, so there's this language barrier. And then, again, almost 40 years later, you get the story out. And it makes you wonder, so why did it take so long to come out?
I'm guessing if you survived Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, you might not like your odds here either. And twice bitten, to move on. But you're right, it still has to be a legend.
Did David Crockett really go down fighting in front of the Alamo Church, or did he surrender and get executed?
So this Crockett story is really interesting because there are so many accounts of his death. And if you look at Crockett as an individual, he was the most famous American that was not the president at the time. He was a popular hero. He was a folk hero. Plays were written about him. Books were written about him. He was a living legend. And no one wants to see a living legend die, right? Let's face it. 1977, August, we had a gentleman by the name of Elvis Presley die, and people kept seeing him alive. Crockett's no different. Now, how he died will always be up for debate because, there's one account that says he was executed. There's an account that says that he was killed in front of the church. There's an account that says it was a man that seemed to be blessed by God. Wherever he seemed to aim his rifle, he seemed to hit the mark. So he's hit in the head with a sword. There's an account that they saw him in a salt mine in Mexico. There's an account that he made it all the way west to California. So the accounts are all different. What we do know is that he did die here. How he died, we're not sure. But newspapers are publishing his death in the United States. And some of them are publishing an execution. Now, the idea of an execution, it's something that happens in war. Now, you fast forward to 1955. You have Fess Parker playing Davy Crockett, King of the Frontier, and a large group of young people saw him die, and I'll make air quotes, because in reality, the screen went dark, right? Disney never killed off their main character. You just assumed that it happened. But how does he go down? Swinging old Betsy. How does John Wayne go down as Crockett? Basically being bayoneted, stuck to a wall, and then he runs back and blows himself up. How does Billy Bob Thornton die? Executed. So you've got different versions of the same story. And they're all based on a narrative that has been basically told since that fateful day on March 6, 1836.
So these things that you compare to like Elvis sightings, those are myths, but the legend is how he died at the Alamo. That's the differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
And think about this. The majority of the Battle of the Alamo is over before dawn. How even would if he's not taken prisoner and executed later, most of these people died anonymously in the dark. It would be questionable if 10 people in the Mexican army would have been able to recognize him in a good event, let alone in the dark and the swirling mist and smoke of the battle and all of that. So we'll never truly know.
But there is a plaque in front of the Alamo Church that says, "Legend states this is where David Crockett died." Where did that information come from?
It came from all those accounts, and they put the one that says that Susanna Dickinson recognized them because of his peculiar hat, which is one of those things also that confuses people because peculiar today means strange. Back then meant belonging to him, of his ownership. He could have had any type of hat, but she recognized him by the hat. Immediately, modern society says, it's a raccoon skin hat. But it could have been just a straw hat. Could have been a felt hat. We'll never really know. What we do know is that her account of his death, the seeing him there, is what prompts that play.
While we're on the topic of Crockett, question number 4. Did he really play the fiddle? Is this a myth or a legend?
That is a myth. We try to find evidence of him playing the fiddle. And there's an account that, McGregor and Crockett play, but nowhere else does it ever mention him playing the fiddle. And that's the thing. It's like he wrote an autobiography of himself and he never talked about playing the fiddle. So did he play the fiddle? Probably not. But it makes for good Hollywood, especially in 2004 where you have Billy Bob Thornton playing a duet with the Mexican army.
Yeah.
It makes for a great narrative.
When we train people here to do our tours, I like to always differentiate story from myth and legend, right? I think when you're a child and your parents are not trying to be very harsh and you're being dishonest with them, a parent might say, did you eat the last cookie? And you did eat the last cookie. And you can say, no, I didn't. And your parents might say, I think you're telling me a story. It's synonymous with a lie. But the reality of it is there's no basis of defining truth or lie in the word story. The word story is completely neutral. A story can be perfectly accurate. We strive in the Department of Interpretation to tell stories, meaning it's very complete. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It leaves you with a sense of what the meaning of the place is. But just to say something as a story doesn't discount it from being true.
What you and your team do is you take what's in the history books and you make it into a palatable story that visitors will want to learn about.
A narrative might be the better word, but story is the word most people use.
Moving on to question number 5. Did James Buie defend himself from his sickbed with pistols and a knife? Is this a myth or a legend?
I guess it's going to have to go legend on this one because James Buie is not heard from in any remark after the second day of the siege. He's not remembered by any of the handful of people that later told their stories. He disappears after that very first encounter of the first day. So how he met his end is pure speculation at this point in time, including a number of people believing that he may have already been deceased from whatever that was ailing him before the final day. I'm sure you can add more to that.
Well, that's the thing that, some of the things that pop up is that, that he did, he had 2 pistols and his knife, and then he's bayoneted. There's accounts that say that he was found covered in a blanket, someone say cowering under a blanket, which brings that idea of maybe he was deceased. There's an account that said they wanted to spare him because he was sick and didn't really fight at all. And then he basically mouthed off to him and they bayoneted him. We'll never know because we won't know a lot of these things, right? Because the accounts that we're getting are mainly our survivors and they're in a different part of the building. And then the Mexican accounts, right? They're still coming out slowly. But again, how many of these soldiers actually knew who he was?
You just set up question number 6 perfectly. There were no survivors. That's a partial truth, correct?
It's partial in that none of the Alamo defenders survived, but we did have survivors in the form of women, children, and the enslaved. And it's one of those really interesting things because when you think about the mythology of the birth of Texas, the Alamo story is big on it. In 1842, General Edward Burleson will give a speech, and he makes a connection with the past by saying Thermopylae had its messenger defeat, the Alamo had none. And so right at that point, he has put the Alamo story with the Greek myth of the 300 Spartans. So that's a big story to tell. And when in reality, we did have messengers. How do we learn about the story? Women, children, and the enslaved. They tell us. That's what makes our story special, because our story comes from the voiceless, the people that typically weren't heard of. And now they're front and center saying what they saw. And one of the most important accounts comes from Joe, who was Travis's slave. And he talks to the provisional government of Texas and explains what he saw. So we know how Travis died. We know that he fell back after Travis's death and continued to fire upon the Mexican armies, and then he hid until the end. And so you're like, wow, it's a powerful story because it's coming from someone that would never have been listened to. And in this case, his voice echoes through time.
And if I may add, it's also not embellished. It doesn't have that air of a Greek tragedy to it. That it's not like Travis was up there fighting tooth and nail to the land. Really quite the opposite. And I don't think it's does a disservice to Travis, but I think it speaks of being a likely, very realistic rendition of that short time period of events.
So the story that there were no survivors, what do we call it? Myth or legend?
No defenders surviving, I think, is probably pretty accurate. But to say that literally no one survived is not accurate.
Question number 7 now. The winter of 1836 was one of the coldest in Texas history. So for some background, I reached out to an old friend for this one, Chris Suchan, the chief meteorologist at a local TV station, News 4 San Antonio. He says official weather records for San Antonio only go back to July 1885. So what do we know about the winter of 1836?
So one of the interesting things is that the Mexican officers are taking weather reports. And when you read the weather report that they're taking, it's like, oh, it's 34 degrees. Oh, it's 40 degrees. So it's not really a harsh winter in Texas. The march north is harsh. And it's because, well, when you're coming north, right, you go through Saltillo, which means little jump. So you're going over a mountain range. Yeah, you're encountering snow and things like that. So it is a cold winter. Is it the coldest? No, but it's harsh on men that are walking, men that are exposed to the elements. Imagine that you've lived in an area that the temperature is at the lowest 80 degrees year-round, and now you're marching through 30 and 40 degree weather. Oh, it's going to be the harshest winter you've ever seen. And it might even kill you, which it did. It killed a lot of people.
But as far as history goes, it's a myth.
Yeah, it's a myth.
I think De La Peña writes that the night of the final attack, so the early morning of March 6th, it's like 40 degrees, which, again, for all of us that get to go home to a nice warm house and apartment and get in our cars and turn the heater on, it's nothing. If you're sleeping on the ground like those men were before the battle, it's going to be miserable. But coldest ever, not even close.
Question number 8. The Battle of the Alamo would not have taken place had the garrison followed Sam Houston's orders to blow up the fort and leave San Antonio. Did Sam Houston really order the whole place to be blown up?
No.
No. No, with no commentary?
The short answer is no.
Well, the thing is that he sends Buie to look over the situation and then make a decision of whether or not they should abandon and destroy the site. But it's strategic, right? It sits on the main roads that come into Texas. It's a strategic spot. And in reality, when we think about the Battle of the Alamo, it's a battle for San Antonio because you control the roads, you control the supplies and everything else coming in. It just so happens that there's a fort that's located on the highest point of downtown San Antonio that oversees the roads. Sam Houston ordering, it blown up. No, it's basically make the decision of whether or not we should.
So this is a myth.
It's part legend, part myth. It's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. And it's the reply to Sam Houston is basically a letter from the commander of the Alamo, James Clinton Neal and James Buie. And it says, we would rather die in these ditches than give them up to the enemy. It's a strategic location, and that's it. If you lose this spot, the towns in East Texas are open and ready to be taken.
You'll look for the next major river crossing on the Camino Real to be the next place where you could stop them. Guadalupe, the various rivers going east. But this is the first reasonably defendable area that they can use.
Okay, moving on to question number 9. The only Texans who rallied to the aid of the Alamo were 32 men from Gonzales. We, of course, would never want to downplay the sacrifices of those men, but there were others on the way, correct?
Yes, There were others. There's actually a letter that's written by Robert McAlpin Williamson, better known as Three-Legged Willie. And he basically, to paraphrase, for God's sake, hold on, help is on the way. People are coming. The problem is, how do you get here? So imagine Washington, Nebraska is approximately 199 miles away from San Antonio, and you take off from there to come to the aid of the Alamo, and you're on foot. how fast do you think you're going to get here?
Not fast at all.
Not fast enough. And there's a group of men that are gathering at Gonzales when the Alamo falls. And they're with James Clinton Neal, who had left and said, I'm coming back with men and supplies. He's kept his word. Problem is, he doesn't get here on time. So there is help coming. It's just slow in getting here.
Well, is this another one that's like column A, column B, part myth, part legend?
I'm going to say maybe more myth, because, the thing is, too, hindsight's 2020. We know that the siege lasted 13 days. No one else knew that. Sieges historically, although this one likely could never have done it, historically, sieges have gone on for months and even years. So people from Washington and the Brazos might have been able to make it if it would have been one of those long, drawn-out affairs. Now, circumstances likely would have never allowed that to happen. But, yeah, it's that little piece of information that we know now shows us that likely no one, Gonzales being the closest community, would have been almost the only one that could have made it in time.
Finally, number 10, the men of the Alamo could have left at any time because they were volunteers. True or false?
False, because they were volunteers, but they had enlisted to be volunteers, and you just can't leave. The other thing is you're surrounded. You try to leave as a group, what's going to happen, right? In December of 1835, the Tornell Decree is published, which is, Mexico's not at war. Anyone fighting against Mexico is a pirate or traitor and should be treated as such. When the first shot at the Alamo was fired, no quarter would be given, which means if you try to run, you were going to be taken out.
At a certain point, if you were here, you were here.
That's right. And think about it, even today, the United States Army today is a 100% volunteer force. There is currently no draft or anything of the sort, but once you go into the recruiting office in the mall and sign your name, you can't just decide your mama's calling and leaving. You have committed. Not only is there a legal obligation, but I would argue in this day and age, too, they thought a great deal more of their moral obligation, that their word is the law, and if they said they're going to do it, they're going to do it.
So we can safely call this one a myth.
Yes.
Now that we've sorted through 10 myths and legends, how do we put them in their proper place when it comes to storytelling?
I think they're all critical. I think as long as you qualify the story for what it is, it's a wonderful piece of the tapestry to build a beautiful story that people can remember and become emotionally connected to. The critical element is to be able to qualify the elements for what they are. We know this for a fact. We know this is nonsense. We have no idea if this is true or not. As long as you say it up front, I think you're in perfect position to weave together a remarkable story.
Like Tom said, it's a tapestry, and every thread counts, and every thread builds upon something. And we need to remember that. Even the myths help us to tell the story. It helps us to show what people were thinking, how they thought, and it also adds to explaining the birth of Texas as a republic. It helps to explain, what people were thinking. It's like, you look at the history, it's really interesting because these men that did an extraordinary thing in 1836 are still seen as just normal men. But as the decades go by, we have a centennial. And all of a sudden, in the centennial, they moved up a step. And so now they're put on pedestals. And because it's a time when we're remembering our heroes. You fast forward, and we're in an age of taking down pedestals. It's a critical thing because our job is to interpret the history and to show that these are people with flaws. We have to tell all sides because that's what makes it a better story. And how do you, the myth of the Buie knife, it's like people are like, it's made out of a meteorite, and you think about that and you're like, interesting. Now, the Buie knife itself, right, it has its own myth behind it. And if you look at several Buie knives, you see how they grow. As the myth grows, the knife gets bigger. And you think about it, it's like...
You see that illustrated in the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center pretty well.
Mm-hmm. And and that's the way that our story is built, right? If you read Joe's account that he gives to the government, it's straightforward. And then a few years later, another layer is added and another layer. And so we're basically creating our own version of an onion. And some of the layers are just filler with an incredible myth attached to it, and others are fully based in fact. It all goes together.
Ernesto Rodriguez and Tom Castanos, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. It's always a pleasure, Emily.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We have a link to a special after-hours tour on July 25th of the Alamo grounds that dives into all these myths and legends and the places where they allegedly happened. We're also going to link you to our main events page, so as we plan more of these after-hours tours, you'll be in the know. Remember, Friends of the Alamo members get early access to our special events, so we'll include a link to where you can join and eventually get first dibs on tickets. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.